You scroll for 45 minutes and feel emptier than before you started. You have more ways to connect with people than any generation in human history, and yet you feel profoundly alone. You know exactly what you should be doing with your life. You've watched the TED Talks, you've read the threads, you've listened to the podcasts. And somehow that knowledge makes the paralysis worse, not better. And by the end of this, you will understand why Gen Z isn't struggling because they're weak, but because they were handed a world that was broken before they were old enough to ask why. There's a story we keep telling about Gen Z. You've probably heard it, maybe even said it yourself, that they're fragile, that they can't take criticism, that they're addicted to their phones, obsessed with identity politics, incapable of commitment, allergic to hard work. Every generation gets a label, but Gen Z got a particularly ungenerous one. They're the generation that got participation trophies and turned into adults who can't handle losing. But here's the paradox that no one wants to sit with. Gen Z is also the most educated generation in American history. They're the most diverse. They're the most politically aware young adults ever measured. They came of age during a global pandemic, a mental health crisis, a climate emergency, a racial reckoning, and a complete economic reshuffling. All at the same time, all while their brains were still developing. And they did it with smartphones in their hands and the entire internet watching. The philosopher Albert Camus once wrote that, "The absurd is born out of the confrontation between the human need for clarity and the world's unreasonable silence." Gen Z didn't invent absurdity, but they were the first generation to grow up already knowing the world was absurd and having no one credible enough to tell them otherwise. The conventional response to Gen Z's struggles has been to pathologize them, to say they need more resilience, more grit, more time off screens. And while some of that isn't wrong, it's incomplete in a way that actually makes things worse. Because when you tell someone who is drowning that they need to swim harder, you've just made them responsible for the ocean. Let's go deeper. Because what's happening to Gen Z psychologically is not random. It follows a very specific pattern, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. In 2017, the psychologist John Twenge published research in the journal Clinical Psychological Science showing that depressive symptoms and suicide-related outcomes among American teenagers rose sharply starting right around 2012. That was the year smartphone ownership crossed 50% among American adolescents. Twenge was careful not to claim simple causation, but the correlation was striking, and it wasn't just the phones themselves. It was the social architecture that the phones plugged them into. Instagram, Snapchat, later TikTok, platforms designed by behavioral scientists to be as engaging as possible, using variable reward schedules, the same psychological mechanism that makes slot machines addictive. Think about what that means. A 16-year-old in 2018 wasn't just dealing with the normal social pressures of high school. They were navigating a real-time social ranking system that ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, inside the device on their nightstand. The feedback was instant. The humiliation could be public. The comparison was global. Previous generations had to wait until Monday to find out they weren't invited to a party. Gen Z found out in real time, on Saturday night, with photographic evidence. There's a concept in psychology called social comparison theory, first developed by Leon Festinger in 1954, which says that humans have a deep, almost biological drive to evaluate themselves by comparing themselves to others. This is not pathological. It's how we calibrate. The problem is that social media didn't just give Gen Z more comparisons. It gave them an algorithmically curated set of comparisons designed to maximize engagement, which usually means maximizing envy, insecurity, and outrage. You were never just comparing yourself to your classmates anymore. You were comparing yourself to the most attractive, most successful, most curated version of thousands of strangers. All day, every day, starting at age 12. Here's the metaphor I keep coming back to. Imagine you're trying to calibrate a scale, but every weight you're using to calibrate it is fake. That's what growing up on social media did to Gen Z's internal sense of self-worth. They were calibrating their identity against images that weren't real, expectations that were impossible, and timelines that were fabricated. And then we asked them why. They seemed so uncertain about who they were. But it goes beyond the phone. There's something else happening that's harder to name, and it lives at the intersection of psychology and economics. The psychologist Martin Seligman, famous for developing the field of positive psychology, also gave us the concept of learned helplessness. Originally observed in dogs exposed to inescapable shocks, the idea is simple and devastating. When an organism repeatedly experiences negative outcomes that it has no control over, it eventually stops trying, even when control becomes possible. It internalizes the belief that effort is futile. Now apply that to Gen Z and the economy. The average American home now costs over $400,000. For a 23-year-old earning $45,000 a year in an entry-level job, that is not a goal that hard work can reasonably achieve. Student loan debt in the United States has crossed $1.7 trillion, and Gen Z watched millennials get buried under it before them. The promise that was made to every prior generation, work hard, play by the rules, and you will build a stable life, that promise was broken. And Gen Z didn't break it. They just arrived after the contract had already been torn up. So what you have is a generation that is psychologically hyperstimulated by social media, economically precluded from the traditional markers of adulthood, politically overwhelmed by crises that feel both urgent and intractable, and then blamed for responding to all of that with anxiety and disengagement. The conventional framework says, fix the person. The honest framework says, look at the system. Sit with that for a moment. Because the discomfort you might be feeling right now, if you are Gen Z, it might be recognition. If you are older, it might be something more complicated. And that discomfort is exactly where the reframe begins. There's a concept from the work of the psychologist Erik Erikson that I think is essential for understanding Gen Z. And it's one that doesn't get enough attention outside of academic psychology. Erikson described a stage of development he called identity versus role confusion, which typically occurs during adolescence and young adulthood. The core psychological task of this stage is exactly what it sounds like, figuring out who you are, what you value, what roles you want to occupy in the world. It's the developmental project of becoming a self. Every generation goes through this. But Gen Z is going through it under conditions that Erikson never could have anticipated. They're forming their identity in public, on platforms where identity is performed and evaluated in real time. They're doing it during a period of profound social and political upheaval, when the very categories of identity, gender, race, nationality, class, are being contested and redefined. And they're doing it with a brain that, as neuroscience now confirms, isn't fully developed until around age 25, particularly in the prefrontal cortex, which is exactly the region responsible for long-term thinking, impulse control, and weighing consequences. This is not an excuse, it's a context. And context is not the same as excuse. The philosopher Viktor Frankl, who survived the Nazi concentration camps and went on to develop logotherapy, argued that the primary human drive is not pleasure or power, it is meaning. In his book Man's Search for Meaning, he wrote that those who have a why to live can bear almost any how. Frankl's insight was that humans can endure enormous suffering if that suffering is embedded in a larger sense of purpose. What they cannot endure is suffering that feels random, pointless, and unseen. Gen Z's crisis is, at its core, a crisis of meaning. Not because they are shallow or ungrateful, but because the meaning-making structures that previous generations relied on, stable careers, religious institutions, community belonging, clear social roles, have either dissolved or become inaccessible to them. They are being asked to construct a sense of purpose in a landscape where the old scaffolding has been torn down and no new scaffolding has been built. The psychologist Fromm, writing in the 1950s in Escape from Freedom, described a phenomenon that feels eerily applicable today. He argued that freedom, which we typically think of as purely liberating, can also be deeply terrifying. When you have genuine freedom, freedom from traditional structures, from prescribed roles, from inherited identities, you are also confronted with the full weight of responsibility for your own life. And that weight, Fromm said, can produce not liberation, but anxiety, conformism, and a desperate search for something to submit to. Sound familiar? Gen Z has more personal freedom than any generation before them, and they are more anxious than any generation before them. That is not a coincidence. It's Fromm's paradox playing out in real time. But here's where the reframe gets interesting. Because the Stoic philosophers, Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, Seneca, had something important to say about exactly this kind of situation. Epictetus, who was born a slave and spent his early life with zero freedom and zero social status, developed a philosophy built around a single distinction: the difference between what is up to us and what is not up to us. In Greek, he called it the dichotomy of control. What is up to us? Our judgments, our intentions, our responses, our values. What is not up to us? The economy, the algorithm, other people's opinions, the political situation, housing prices. The Stoic move, and this is not the same as toxic positivity, so stay with me, is not to pretend the external world doesn't matter. It's to redirect your primary investment of energy toward the one domain where you actually have agency. For Gen Z, I think this reframe is both more honest and more liberating than the messages they've been given. The message they've been given is, be resilient, which often sounds like, endure the broken system quietly and perform wellness. The Stoic message is different. It says, the system may be broken, and you are still a moral agent. Your response to injustice matters. Your choices about who you become in the face of difficulty matter. Not because it will fix everything, but because it is the only ground you can actually stand on. Aristotle had a word for this kind of deep, character-based flourishing: eudaimonia. It's often translated as happiness, but that translation loses something crucial. Eudaimonia is closer to flourishing, or living well according to your nature. It's not a feeling, it's a practice. Aristotle believed that eudaimonia came from exercising your distinctly human capacities: reason, virtue, friendship, purpose, in a sustained way over time. It was not something you stumbled into, it was something you built. The reason this matters for Gen Z is that the dominant cultural message they've received about well-being is fundamentally hedonic. It's about feeling good, reducing discomfort, achieving comfort and status. And the research is pretty consistent. Hedonic well-being alone doesn't produce flourishing. What produces flourishing is eudaimonic well-being, having a sense of purpose, contributing to something beyond yourself, developing mastery over time, belonging to genuine communities. Those are harder to get from an algorithm. They require friction. They require investment. They require patience. And Gen Z has been systematically deprived of the conditions that produce eudaimonic well-being, while being oversupplied with the cheap simulacra of hedonic pleasure. That's not weakness. That's a setup. So what do you actually do with all of this? I want to be careful here, because I'm aware that offering a neat 3-step solution after 18 minutes of describing a complex structural problem would be somewhat dishonest. Knowing something intellectually is genuinely different from living it. I've been in conversations where I understood exactly what was happening to me psychologically and was still completely unable to stop it. Understanding the mechanism doesn't automatically hand you the exit. But there are 3 questions, not answers, not prescriptions, just questions that I think are worth sitting with. The first is this: what is one thing in your life that you are doing because you genuinely value it, not because it was recommended by an algorithm, not because it signals something to other people, not because it makes you feel productive, but because it is genuinely intrinsically meaningful to you. It might be small, it probably is small, but identifying it matters because it's the thread you can start to pull. Viktor Frankl believed that meaning isn't found by searching for it directly. It's found as a byproduct of full engagement with life. So the question isn't, what is my purpose? That question often paralyzes people. The question is, what calls for my full attention right now? The second question is harder. Where are you outsourcing your sense of self-worth to something that is fundamentally outside your control? This is the Stoic question, and it stings because most of us are doing this constantly. We outsource it to follower counts, to performance reviews, to whether that person texted back, to how our body looks in a photo. And the problem isn't that those things don't matter at all. It's that they are deeply, structurally unreliable sources of the thing we need most from them, the sense that we are enough. The practice here isn't toxic positivity. It's a slow, deliberate process of relocating your primary source of self-evaluation from the external to the internal, not because external feedback doesn't matter, but because it is not stable ground. The third question is perhaps the most countercultural one I can offer. Are you allowing yourself to be genuinely bad at something for long enough to get good at it? The research on mastery. Going back to Anders Ericsson's work on deliberate practice, popularized in part by Malcolm Gladwell's 10,000 hours idea, suggests that deep competence requires sustained engagement with difficulty. But the attention economy makes everything feel urgent and immediate. The feedback loop has been compressed down to seconds. And one of the things that gets lost in that compression is the tolerance for the long, unglamorous middle of any meaningful endeavor. The part where you're not good yet, the part that has no aesthetic, the part that produces no content worth posting. Gen Z has been trained to skip that part, but that part is where the actual growth happens. None of this is easy. I want to say that clearly. These aren't solutions you implement on a Tuesday morning and then feel better by Friday. They're orientations, ways of leaning, and the fact that you're watching something like this, engaging with these questions, is itself a form of that orientation. The core insight I want to leave you with is this. Gen Z is not a broken generation. They are a generation that grew up inside a set of systems that were optimized for engagement, profit, and efficiency, and not for human flourishing. The anxiety, the identity confusion, the disengagement. These are not character flaws. They are coherent responses to incoherent conditions. But here's what Viktor Frankl understood better than almost anyone, having survived conditions far more brutal than any algorithm. The human capacity to choose your response, even within systems you didn't design and can't fully control, is not nothing. It is, in fact, everything. Not because it changes the system, but because it determines who you become inside of it. The poet Rainer Maria Rilke wrote in Letters to a Young Poet something that I keep returning to, and that I think speaks directly to what Gen Z is navigating. I would like to beg you, dear friend, as well as I can, to have patience with everything unresolved in your heart, and to try to love the questions themselves as if they were locked rooms or books written in a very foreign language. Don't search for the answers, which could not be given to you now, because you would not be able to live them. And the point is to live everything. Live the questions now. Perhaps then, someday far in the future, you will gradually, without even noticing it, live your way into the answer. That's not resignation. That's one of the most demanding invitations ever written. If this is the kind of conversation you want more of, subscribing means you won't miss the next one. And I'm genuinely curious. What's one thing you've been told is wrong with your generation that you think is actually a rational response to something broken in the world around you? Leave it in the comments. I read them.